Hello everyone, Mr. McTidge here. On a recent episode of my podcast F#A# Revisited, which you should all check out by the way, we're on Podbean, iTunes and even have a channel here on YouTube, links in the description, I talked a bit about how much I love Planetarium, a collaborative effort between indie giant Sufjan Stevens, the national guitarist Bryce Dessner, modern classical composer Nico Muhly and drummer James McAlister, the album version of which was released last month. On the podcast episode, I didn't really have enough time to fully explore why I hold this album in such a high regard, which is what I plan to do here. Another reason I particularly wanted to dissect this album is because several music critics have criticised this album, calling it overly ambitious, bloated, or even disorganised, and I'm here to say that they're all wrong. And of course I'm saying that in jest, but I found this album to be so symbolically powerful with such an incredible flow of ideas with such a unique sound that it kept me constantly engaged throughout its 76-minute runtime. To the point that it's one of my favourite albums not only of the year, but also of the decade, and perhaps even of the century so far. And in this video I will attempt to explain why it's such an outstanding album. The album starts with Neptune, which is a fantastic opener as the lyrics preface the magnitude of the concepts on Planetarium. What's right and what's wrong, don't you hold me too lightly to words, as I've rounded them off to the nearest of 10, for I have gathered your body in envious capture, in envious thought. Oh forgive me, O gods, oh forgive me in fortune, forgive me in feeling it out for myself, as I ought to have feelings for something as great as thou art. In this album, Stevens draws upon the mythology behind the names of the planets to draw out stories, concepts and abstractions that help shape both the instrumental backings to each track, but also how the more physical elements of the planets can be interpreted. What's so wonderful about the way he introduces this incredibly ambitious and fluid way of writing about all these planets is how it's reflected in the instrumental backing of the opening track. Neptune is the Roman god of the sea, and you can hear in the flowing, oddly structured, rhythmical phraseology a sense of serene fluidity that you can very much imagine being the sea, but of course this also represents how fluidly Stevens' lyrical connections will work, in order to bring out the sublime in these mythological stories and concepts. Stevens then articulates a negotiation with the sea in a humble admittance that he does not necessarily have command of these concepts but will allow the concepts to shape his lyrical portrayals throughout the album. Converse me, strange waters, come and obey me, strange waters, have it your own way. So if you won't hold me, I have no objections. So if you won't please me, I make no commands. So if you don't trust me, it's best if I drown. The last line in particular I think relates heavily to the listener. Stevens knows that the lyrical concepts may be too conceptually and mythologically distant for some people to want to put the effort into understanding, and gives them an option for wanting to opt out. Personally, I think this is a really humbling and smart thing to do, because this project might just be the most artistically dense album in terms of articulating multiple levels of meaning that Stevens or any other artist has done in a very long time. Indeed, I would happily admit this album isn't for everyone, but for those who enjoy exploring layers of meaning, this album is an absolute goldmine. The track Neptune works itself into a subtle but delicate climax as the light, delicate but powerful waves find themselves translated into music form through lovely string and brass swells. Stevens' vocals through them almost feel as though he's navigating the sea himself, trying not to drown in its own wonderful auditory imagery. After the preface of Neptune, we then have the second track, Jupiter. I think the placing of Jupiter after Neptune is fantastic. After the softness of Neptune, the synths and drum patterns of Jupiter feel impactful but not overwhelming, which immediately gives an auditory scope for Jupiter's vast physical size, which only seems to increase over the course of the song, particularly with the gorgeous and serene classical instrumentation around the 3.5-minute mark, contrasted with the aggressive electronic drumming at around the 5 minutes, displaying the enormity of Jupiter and provides context for the song Jupiter's lyrical themes. This song is probably my favourite on Planetarium, and that's more so because I found the meaning behind the story of the song so impactful. And it's a meaning that takes a lot of unpacking because there's so much symbolism going on here, and it really does highlight how much a song like Neptune is necessary as an introduction for this album to ground the listener into how intense the lyrical themes on this project are. The song starts off by talking about this father figure who is identified as human as he toils under Adam's labour, i.e. the Christian concept of the punishment of original sin that all humans have to bear. Alongside this working man, a creature, Lucifer, is formed, i.e. the devil or the personification of sin or human destructiveness that Stephens uses as an analogy for Jupiter. But then there's an interesting turn in the lyrics. My father, late at night, forbidding death, kissed the light, and Jupiter was transformed. So Lucifer's presence was tempting the father figure into sin, the punishment of which in Christian theology is death, but the human is able to reject this. And then the voice of Jupiter speaks, I need you to change me, prevent me, persuade me, by Jove, I need you. And this is when the power of the symbolism that Stephens is employing here really struck me, as my mind linked back to the physical properties of Jupiter and its place in our solar system. Stephens' likening Jupiter to the devil makes perfect sense, as its gravitational pull makes it one of the most deadliest and inescapable planets in the solar system, much like sin is deadly and inescapable in humans in Christian theology. But the transformation Jupiter goes through in the song allows it to use its destructiveness as a means of doing good for the human, much like how the planet Jupiter protects Earth from comets with its enormous gravitational pull, and the execution of the concept of turning something so purely evil into a force for good is so brilliantly done here, made all the more bittersweet by the inclusion of the line, Jupiter is the loneliest planet. The sentiment is so well done here, it's such a beautiful message, and easily one of my favourite songs of the year. Following Jupiter, we have the first instrumental of the album, Halley's Comet, which is a nice, short, electronic interlude allowing the enormity of the concepts and sounds of Jupiter to flow into the more languid and understated song, Venus. What I find entertaining about Halley's Comet is that if you're putting this album on in the background to whatever else you're doing rather than paying attention track by track, then this interlude is very easy to miss, and can easily be heard as a coda to Jupiter or an intro to Venus, and becomes comically representative of Halley's Comet, which can only be seen every 70 years or so from Earth. Moving on to Venus, Venus starts with some languid, subdued electronic percussion, very Bjorkian, and very appropriate because, as we all know, Bjork writes the best songs about sex, and Venus is a song about just that. I love how the dolce consonant melodies become embedded in these ethereal echoing backgrounds, affecting a real sense of bliss in the music. Again, I find the lyrics so interesting in this song. Stephens starts by referencing a personal, human sexual experience he has had before going on to gradually make references to ancient culture and the divine to explore this sexuality. He references Pandemos, a surname to Aphrodite, to describe her presence on Earth, and also a Callipygian, referring to the Roman standard of physical female beauty. Stephens seems to be bringing mythology into the everyday human experience to evoke this sublime idea that human sexuality transcends mortality into godly territory, both in terms of function and euphoria. The choirs and tinkles are also just a lovely, tender touch at the end of the song, rounding off the song's blissful soundscape. Again, the flow of Planetarium is shown to be so strong as the next song, Uranus, provides an interesting compare and contrast exercise against Venus. And it's highlighted that we should view these songs as a pair through how both Venus and Uranus have similar 3-time rhythmical structures with upbeat tempos but mellow arrangements. While Venus takes a positive view towards sex, Uranus shows a different side to this point of view. Stephens' opening lyrics are, "What are you now, castrated by your son?" and so draws upon the Roman mythos again to lay down the mood of the song. Without sex, what is your function appears to be the implicit message here. The tone becomes more accusatory as Stephens sings, "You sexless fraud," from Chaos Choreographed, and so there's this real feeling of wanting to castigate Uranus for being different. I find there are different ways to interpret this mood in the song. It could be Uranus reflecting upon himself, devastated and self-loathing from how he has been castrated. However, through most of the album, Stephens uses vocoder vocals to indicate that he's directly speaking from the planet figure's point of view, and so I'm led to assume he's coming at this from a human perspective, which I personally find a lot more harrowing. The tribalistic nature of othering people for being different is unfortunately quite characteristic of humans a lot of the time, and I believe Stevens' condemning comments on Uranus to be a reflection on that. Again, I'd like to point out how well the lyrical angle of this song reflects the physical properties of the planet. Uranus is on a different orbital plane to all the other planets in the solar system, and has a huge 98-degree tilt, which links it perfectly to the lyrical themes of difference and othering, and contrasted with Venus provides an interesting dual comment on humanity's obsession with sex and obsession with telling people how it should be viewed or experienced. We then move on to Mars. I love the instrumental backing to this track. The mix of spiraling guitars, abrasive industrial electronic drumming, and other electronic sounds is so unique and satisfying, and feels very welcome after the mellowness of the previous two tracks. This opening then gives way to very distorted vocoder vocals representing the voice of Mars, the god of war. This song definitely foregrounds its aggression. It's hard to analyse every lyric in this song one by one because I think the point of this song's lyrics is how it all comes together. The two verses in the songs open with statements that openly contradict each other. In the future there will be no war, and in the future there will only be war. Half-articulated arguments of inevitability penetrate the verses. I reside in every creature, as it is written. And then the verses end with a commanding ultimatum, dispose of the future or put away your sword, which feels like an urgent authoritative demand but makes less sense the more I think about it. But that's the entire point of the song. Stevens succeeds in portraying the god of war as desperate, manipulative, controlling, and having complete disregard for the intellectual. I found it such powerful symbolism to portray the god of Mars this way, as, of course, it's a striking reflection on how humans have engineered wars both past and present with hysteria, extreme language, and manipulation. I found this song then leading into the dark, desolate instrumental piece of Black Energy with its murky, ambient, dissonant synths quite profound, giving us a demonstration of the after effects of war. Perhaps even more profound is how this representation of complete futility, of nothingness, is then followed up by a rebirth in the next instrumental track, Sun, which follows so naturally from Dark Energy you'd be forgiven for thinking it's the same track. Sun feels as though Black Energy's ambience is reborn with these keyboard sounds that I found reminiscent of Super Mario Galaxy, which for reference is my favourite video game soundtrack, so gets a thumbs up from me. But there's this very satisfying narrative coming across from Mars through to Sun, that the universe and human nature might be horrible, abominable at times, but there's always a chance that something new, something better can come out of it, be reborn out of the destruction. In Planetarium, even the instrumental pieces manage to be poignant and philosophical without Stevens having to say a word. After Sun we have Tides, which is just another gorgeous ambient instrumental. It's only a minute long but helps with this feeling of space exploration that is embedded within the album, and links Sun to the next track, Moon. After the rather grand concepts of sex, war, darkness and rebirth, Moon stands out and feels welcome in its modest sound and concept. Again, we hear Bjorkian electronics that sound just gorgeous, and it just feels as though you can melt into the texture of the song. For the lyrics of Moon, Stevens chooses to draw upon the myth of the moon rabbit who gave herself up for food so that Quetzalcoatl, a god who was living as a human on Earth, could eat. Because of this, Quetzalcoatl elevates the rabbit up to the moon, making the moon rabbit's imprint. Then, interestingly, the second verse retells an alternative story for the imprint on the moon, a Native American story in which a crane agrees to carry a rabbit up to the moon, and the crane carrying the rabbit all the way is what stretches the crane's legs. This song is refreshingly quaint in concept, perhaps reflecting the moon's small size in comparison to all the other planets and concepts being dealt with in this album, but I still think there's something interesting going on here. Both stories are ones about self-sacrifice, one to fill someone else's needs, the other to fill someone else's desires, which is interesting when you relate it back to the moon itself. It's a big part of life on Earth in the present day. It's mainly just controlling our tides, but in ancient cultures, its phases were used to determine months, as well as being sources of light during the night. And so there's this indirect characterization of the moon as a selfless servant to the Earth, which is a lovely, sublime, romantic concept, and makes a nice break from some of the heavier themes on the album. The next track, Pluto, continues the modest sounds from Moon in a way that flows beautifully. Instrumentally, this is probably my favourite song on the album. Dessner's guitar work here is beautiful, Stevens' melodies are mellifluous, Muhly's symphonic arrangements are sweepingly gorgeous but not overstated, and the soft pound of the bass drum may not be complicated, but it gives a really satisfying depth to Pluto's sound. And the electronics that permeate the piece feel bubbly but controlled. Just the overall feel of the piece is so gorgeous, I could easily listen to it over and over again. In Greek mythology, Pluto, or Hades, was the ruler of the underworld. What's interesting about the concept of Pluto is that he represents a much more positive view of the underworld and the afterlife he presides over than his conflation Hades, whose underworld and practices were much more malicious. Pluto represented material wealth that could come from the underworld, whereas Hades symbolised the entrapment to the human condition. So when Stevens sings, "Pluto, you silly goose, why did you hide behind covenants of shame, smooth and splendid abuse?" it seems to be a cry of why has this more negative interpretation of the underworld and its god prevailed in popular culture. There's definitely a really interesting, deeper philosophical and psychological answer to this question that isn't really discussed in the song, so I won't discuss it here, but I really enjoy musing on how this relates to the scientific view of Pluto, on whether or not it's technically a planet. I believe now it's classed as a dwarf planet, but I read in an article saying its classification has changed since that episode of Rick and Morty first aired. It's hard to keep up with. At any rate, going back to the mythology between Pluto and Hades, Stevens sings in the last verse, "Sworn by Persephone, how melancholy she waits forever for your kiss," which feels so tragic. People see the god of the underworld more often as Hades, the abominable god who abducted Persephone, rather than Pluto, the loving husband of Persephone. And so Stevens makes a very interesting exploration on human perception and the tragedy of our desire to see an example of evil. The album then seems to be moving further and further out of the solar system as Pluto is then followed by the upbeat bubbliness of Kuiper Belt, the jovial exploration of which is soon brought to a harrowing stop with the ephemeral darkness of Black Hole. I really love how the strings of instrumental tracks on this album seem to follow their own little narratives and journeys placed one next to each other, and really gives the album a shape as a whole and a chance for the listener to reflect on some of the bigger themes in some of the songs. Black Hole is rather suitably followed by one of the darkest songs conceptually on the album, Saturn. The momentum of the album is very much picked back up here as we head into the final quarter with quick, upbeat electronics. For as experimental as this album is, this song is the closest to sounding like a pop song with its shorter length, standard structure and tight hooks. Like how Mars used an aggressive vocoder to reflect its content, so does Saturn, but this time the harsh use of vocoder isn't so distorted that it doesn't hide a very deliberate feeling of desperation in Stevens' vocal delivery. Romans identified Saturn with the Greek titan Cronus, who had a particularly gruesome and disturbing story that he ate all his children because of a fear of a prophecy that one of them would overthrow him. Again, there are many psychological and philosophical reasons why this concept is particularly chilling. But what's so interesting about this song is that Stevens attempts to get inside the head of Cronus, and the result is very interesting. This song is punctuated by the cry of "Tell me I'm evil," almost in desperation to be recognised and shamed for his actions, as he describes, without euphemism, the terrible nature of what he's doing. A cannibal addiction, innocent victim, continual affection for my action, vampire creature. This schizophrenic self-loathing seems to be all the more animated by the lively, danceable electronics, which should be distasteful because of the subject matter, but again, that's the point of the song. It's a complex portrayal of self-loathing that we are supposed to find it a bit grotesque that Saturn is being so flagrantly high-octane about articulating his sins. It's both remarkably catchy and chilling in equal measure. The next track, In the Beginning, reorients the listener after Saturn with gorgeously bright ambient layerings representing the creation of Earth, lasting for less than a minute and a half before giving way to the longest track on the album, Earth. Earth is an epic 15 minutes, and whereas other tracks draw upon mythological stories associated with the planets to draw out meaning, Earth takes a more concrete approach of commenting on the story of humanity. The track starts with several minutes of absolute gorgeous symphonic and electronic arrangements before giving way to a soft keyboard sound and Stevens' vocoder vocals. And I would much rather just read out the lyrics to this section of the song. Innocence was never lost, though it may have been insulted. Even if the earth forgot, her inheritance resulted in contradiction, ceremony, benediction, hallelujah. There are no more accidents. Living things refuse to offer explanations of their worth. We in turn avenge the author with paranoia and prediction, exploration, competition, ceremony, inner anguish. Lord, I pray for us. Hallelujah. This biblical language evokes this authoritative air and divine judgment on humanity whose presence has defiled the earth. I love how the vocals phase out in the second verse and the orchestral stabs burst out and the vocals layer up. It feels epic. After this section, the tempo increases and we get some lovely guitar work courtesy of Dessner, and then the lyrics, run, mission, run, before we arrive, gets repeated over and over again, made intermittent with gradually increasing drumming. I really love how throughout this section the electronics seem to become more prevalent, being symbolic of the technological advances that humans have accomplished. And it's a direct contrast to the more organic sounding opening of the track, and it stops rather suddenly as we're introduced to these eerie synth sounds and the lyrics, I see it, the beauty of the earth, on my deathbed, but it's too late. I'm such an idiot. I find there are two ways to interpret this ending. On the one hand, it could be a comment on how humans have altered the natural beauty of the planet, be it either through climate change or us destroying natural habitats for concrete cities, or it could be taken on a much more personal level of someone who has dedicated their life to advancement as described in the song, to the point where they haven't taken any time of their life to appreciate the natural beauty of the earth and is regretful because of it. Either way, this disruptively anticlimactic ending provides a quieting reflection on the nature of humanity's progress and what should be important to us. And then we end on the closing track, Mercury, and here, again, the structure of the album becomes very important because I think Mercury is best interpreted as an extension of Earth, as I think the themes employed between the two tracks are interconnected. Before getting into the lyrical themes, I just want to say how much I love the tenderness of Mercury's sound. Dessner's guitar work is just a joy to listen to, and the light but fluffy textures provide an ethereal yet satisfying closing point to this dense and rich album. The lyrics to this song are pretty disparate, which seems ironic seeing as Mercury is after all the eloquent winged messenger, but there is a recurring line within the song, "You ran off with it all," which is why I think this song should be interpreted as an extension to the story of Earth, but more specifically, as Mercury was winged and is the closest planet to the Sun, I think this song should be interpreted through the lens of the myth of Icarus. For those who don't know, Icarus was fashioned a pair of wax wings to escape Crete, but flew too close to the Sun, so his wings melted and he fell and died. This story seems to directly parallel the story Stevens tells in the song Earth, where individual humans, or humanity as a whole, regret their recklessness. And so Stevens is evoking the divine messenger Mercury to strengthen his polemic, and Icarus to make a poignant message to humanity to end the album on, that humans need to appreciate Earth and the natural beauty she has to offer. So there is my case as to why I think Planetarium by Stevens, Muhly, Dessner and McAlister is such an outstanding album. In summary, It's one of the most interesting, diverse and consistently engaging blends of electronic, classical and ambient that I have perhaps ever heard, aside from Programme Music 1. I know I've talked mostly about the lyrical themes on this album, but I've pointed out enough examples in this analysis to justify saying this album is gorgeous throughout, with its own unique sonic feel. The shape and flow of the album makes the quite lengthy runtime feel like nothing at all. Each track flows naturally and exploratively into the next, really making you feel like you're exploring a planetarium. I love how the planets are often placed next to each other, often so that the lyrical content of one helps make the lyrical content of another more poignant, and the mini-narratives throughout the album help make the album a smooth listen. The power of the symbolism on this album is off the charts. Granted, there is a lot of innate symbolic power in the myths that Stevens is drawing from. There's a reason why these stories have stood the test of time. But the way he draws the sublime out of them by relating them to the physical properties of the planets and also the personal human perspective is, and I don't use this word lightly, in fact I've spent most of this analysis justifying it, it's genius. I have to admit, it does sadden me a little that there seems to be quite a few people that don't quite see what I do in Planetarium, and if you're one of those people, hopefully I've convinced you of perhaps another perspective to take on this album, as I can't think of another album this decade I would like to see canonised, taught in schools, and listened to more in 50 years' time. I hope you enjoyed my analysis. If you did, make sure to subscribe for more admittedly quite irregularly uploaded music analysis videos, and if you like more informal chats about recent releases, please consider checking out my podcast F#A# Revisited. Links will be in the description. But until next time, stay awesome.